The war was over. Earth had emerged victorious, though at a terrible cost. The cities lay in ruins, ecosystems damaged beyond repair, and countless lives lost. The alien invaders, an empire that had once ruled over countless worlds, were now scattered, broken, and on the brink of collapse. They had underestimated Earth's Deathworld ecosystem, an environment full of dangers they had not anticipated. Humanity's will to survive, its adaptability, and sheer grit had carried it through. But victory came at a steep price. The aliens were defeated, but the scars they left were deep, and healing seemed impossible. Captain Mara Quinn stood amid the devastation, looking at what remained of a once thriving city. The people around her were silent, lost in their grief. But it was more than grief, it was rage. The memories of the war, the bloodshed, the terror, the lives that had been lost, had forged a deep hatred for the aliens who dared to invade. There were no celebrations, no joy in their victory. The war was over, but the wounds were fresh. In the midst of the wreckage, the peace talks began. An alien delegation, led by Admiral Vrail, arrived under a flag of truce. It was a sight that few had ever imagined: alien soldiers, once feared as conquerors, now walking the earth in search of peace. They came not with weapons but with offers, reparations, assistance in rebuilding, and promises of cooperation. They were desperate for peace, but would it be enough? Mara Quinn didn't believe so. She had led troops in the trenches, had seen firsthand the horrors the aliens had brought. She couldn't forgive them, not yet. The memories of her fallen comrades haunted her every step, and the idea of simply shaking hands and moving on felt like betrayal. She was not the only one who felt this way. There were many like her, war-weary but unwilling to let the invaders off the hook. Justice had to be served. Diplomat Cale Voss, on the other hand, was the voice of reason. He had spent years in negotiations, navigating the politics of peace in a galaxy that often failed to understand humanity's drive for survival. He knew that if they were to have any hope of avoiding another war, they had to embrace diplomacy. But even he wasn't sure the alien empire's offer was genuine. Were they truly seeking peace, or were they biding their time, waiting for humanity to lower its guard? The peace talks were fragile, with both sides playing a dangerous game of trust and mistrust. When the talks began in earnest, the tension was palpable. Admiral Vrail spoke earnestly, offering Earth resources, technology, and reparations for the devastation they had caused. He expressed deep remorse, emphasizing that not all of his people had supported the war. Some, like him, had opposed it from the beginning, but had been forced into submission by a ruthless regime. He pleaded for a chance to rebuild, for a chance at peace. But Mara Quinn wasn't so easily swayed. She stood firm, demanding that the aliens be held accountable for their actions. The idea of letting them off with a simple apology and a few tokens of goodwill felt like dishonoring the memories of those who had died. She insisted on reparations, military accountability, and, if necessary, the dismantling of the alien leadership. They couldn't risk another invasion, couldn't allow themselves to be blindsided again. The talks stalled. Both sides dug in, unwilling to compromise. As the days dragged on, the distrust grew. The humans feared that the aliens were plotting another invasion, using the peace talks as a cover to regroup. Quinn's faction grew more vocal in their opposition to any form of peace. They were ready to fight, ready to finish what they had started. But Cale Voss pushed for patience, hoping to find a middle ground, to avoid another catastrophic war. Yet, there was a nagging suspicion that neither side was being fully honest. Cale Voss began to suspect that Admiral Vrail was hiding something. There were whispers among the humans about hidden alien communications, messages intercepted from alien military factions, suggesting that they were not as sincere as they seemed. Voss couldn't ignore the possibility that Vrail's offers were a ruse, a way to buy time for a second invasion. On the other side, the humans were not innocent. Some factions, particularly within the military-industrial complex, saw the peace talks as a way to further their own agendas. They were planning, in secret, for a preemptive strike, destroying the alien empire before it could ever regain its strength. They believed that once an enemy was defeated, it should never be allowed to rise again. The stakes had never been higher. It wasn't just about peace or war anymore. It was about trust. Who could they trust? The aliens? Their own people? Everyone seemed to have an agenda, and no one could be certain of their true intentions. One evening, Kale Voss received a message from Vrail. It was a private communication, one that had been carefully guarded. Vrail admitted that he had never agreed with the invasion. He had fought against it within his own empire, but his voice had been drowned out by the war machine. His people had suffered just as much as the humans, and he now found himself fighting for peace, even if it meant betraying his own. Vrail's confession rocked Voss to his core. He had suspected the alien leader's sincerity, but now he knew it to be true. Vrail was not the enemy. But could humanity trust him? Could they afford to risk everything on the word of a former conqueror? The talks reached a breaking point. Quinn's faction, frustrated and enraged by the lack of resolution, prepared for military action. They felt betrayed by their leaders, by the very idea of trusting the aliens. But Voss, now certain that Vrail was a genuine ally, made one final appeal for peace. He offered a proposal: strict monitoring, stringent conditions, and oversight to ensure the aliens held to their promises. It was a delicate balance, one that would require both sides to take a leap of faith. Quinn stood at the crossroads. Her heart told her to strike, to avenge the fallen, to ensure humanity's safety at all costs. But her mind told her that another war would only lead to more destruction. The cycle of violence had to end, or humanity would become the very thing it had fought against. In the end, Quinn made the hard choice. She ordered her troops to stand down. The decision wasn't easy, and there were many who disagreed, but it was the only way forward. The peace talks would continue, but with the understanding that humanity would never let its guard down again. There was no guarantee that the aliens would keep their word, but there was no guarantee that another war would leave humanity any better off. The treaty was signed, though its future was uncertain. Peace was fragile, and trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. But humanity had taken its first step towards something new. The scars of war would never fully heal, but there was a glimmer of hope that the future could be different. The road to peace was never simple. It would require vigilance, sacrifice, and most of all, trust. And while the wounds of war would never fade, humanity had learned something vital. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do was to trust again. But without it, there could be no future. The peace talks were underway, but tension was thick in the air. Admiral Vrail, the leader of the alien delegation, stood before humanity's representatives, offering reparations and resources to begin the process of rebuilding Earth. The war had left the alien empire fractured, and they were desperate. Their once glorious fleet had been decimated, their colonies reduced to ashes. But even in their defeat, the aliens sought one thing above all: survival. They believed peace was the only path forward. For Vrail, the situation was personal. He had fought against the invasion from the start, though his dissent was always silenced by his superiors. He had believed the alien empire was making a grave mistake, but the war machine was too powerful, and the invasion went forward. Now, as Earth lay in ruins, he hoped humanity could show mercy, that the destruction could end, and that something could be salvaged. But there were others who could not forget the horror the aliens had caused. Captain Mara Quinn, a decorated military officer, stood in direct opposition to the peace process. She had lost countless soldiers under her command, and the scars of battle were still fresh. To her, the aliens didn't deserve forgiveness. There could be no peace unless they paid for their crimes. Reparations weren't enough. They had to face justice for every life lost, every building burned, every family torn apart. The thought of letting the invaders go free was intolerable. The argument was fierce in the initial sessions. Voss, who had been tasked with guiding the talks toward peace, found himself caught between two sides. As a diplomat, he saw the potential for cooperation. He understood the fragile state of the alien empire, and recognized that humanity's future would be shaped by how they responded to the situation. However, Voss also harbored doubts. How could they trust the aliens, who had so recently tried to enslave them? There were whispers among the human military that the peace talks were nothing more than a diversion, that the aliens had come not to negotiate but to buy time for another invasion. Quinn's faction was growing more vocal. They wanted action, not words. They had seen the destruction the aliens were capable of, and they were determined not to be caught off guard again. They insisted that the aliens should pay for the damage they had caused, not be allowed to walk away unscathed. Quinn pushed for full disarmament of the alien fleet and the dismantling of their leadership. She believed that only by making the aliens weak would humanity ensure their own survival. Cale Voss, however, understood the importance of compromise. He argued that humanity could not become like their enemies. Revenge might be tempting, but it would only create a cycle of violence. Voss knew that any peace agreement would require both sides to make concessions, and he proposed that the aliens would be held accountable, but that humanity should take the first step toward rebuilding a new future, not simply retribution. The alien delegation, led by Admiral Vrail, agreed to some of humanity's demands, offering reparations and dismantling their military presence in exchange for a ceasefire and peace talks. But the question remained, was this a genuine offer, or was it a trap? Vrail swore that the alien empire's leadership had been replaced, that they were no longer the conquerors they once were, but few trusted him. His promises were met with suspicion, not just from the humans but from his own people as well. Behind closed doors, the human leadership began to fracture. Some factions, mainly from the military, argued that no peace should be struck. They were adamant that the aliens could not be trusted, and any deal with them would only invite further treachery. Quinn's group, already on edge, felt that the time for negotiations had passed. They wanted action, not more speeches. They believed that peace, if it could be called that, would only embolden the aliens and put humanity at risk. On the other side, Voss found himself under increasing pressure to produce results. His own colleagues were questioning whether he could bring the talks to a successful conclusion. But each passing day of negotiations made him more uncertain. Vrail seemed sincere, but the alien empire had a long history of manipulation, deceit, and broken promises. Was this truly a new era for the aliens, or were they simply trying to buy time? Despite the mounting pressure, Voss pushed forward. He knew that without peace, both sides would be doomed to continue the cycle of violence. Yet every time the talks seemed to move forward, new doubts emerged. The aliens, while offering concessions, had too much to lose by fully disarming. And the humans, while pushing for accountability, risked becoming just as oppressive as the invaders had been. As the talks progressed, Voss started to uncover disturbing information. Intercepts from the alien military suggested that Vrail's position was not entirely as it seemed. There were still factions within the alien empire that were loyal to the old ways, the ways of conquest and war. Some of these factions were using the peace talks to regroup, to prepare for a new offensive once Earth's guard was lowered. Voss could not ignore the evidence. His gut told him that the aliens were not as unified as they appeared. But the more Voss investigated, the more troubling his findings became. It wasn't just the aliens. Human factions were preparing for their own kind of war, too. While the diplomats negotiated in good faith, military leaders were positioning themselves for another conflict. Some of the more hawkish elements in the human command structure were already organizing covert operations, planning to strike the alien capital and ensure that no alien fleet could ever threaten Earth again. Voss found himself at a crossroads. He knew that peace could be achieved, but only if both sides were willing to make sacrifices. Was it worth trusting the aliens? Would they truly keep their word? Or was he walking into a trap, one that could destroy all of humanity? At what point did diplomacy become naivete? One night, Voss received a message from Vrail. It was more than just an official communication, it was a confession. Vrail admitted that the war had been a mistake from the start, that he had tried to stop it but had been silenced by his superiors. The alien leader now found himself in a precarious position. The Empire was in shambles, and he was one of the few left who genuinely believed in the potential for peace. Vrail's words echoed in Voss's mind. Was this alien a true believer, or was he simply trying to preserve his own life? Voss's mind raced. He was close to making a decision that could change everything. Could he trust Vrail, or had the aliens simply learned to be better liars? With tensions escalating on both sides, Voss knew that the next move would be decisive. A single misstep could shatter the fragile peace that had been built and plunge both worlds into a new war, one even more devastating than the last. As the negotiations continued, Voss grew more determined to find the truth. There was too much at stake. Humanity's future depended on this decision. But with each new revelation, the lines between friend and foe became more blurred. Would humanity emerge stronger, or would they fall prey to the same darkness they had just defeated? In the end, the decision lay in Voss's hands, but the consequences would affect everyone. The question remained, could humanity trust its former enemies enough to build a future together, or would vengeance win out, condemning both sides to another bloody chapter of history? The peace talks had reached a critical point. On the surface, it seemed as though progress was being made. The alien delegation, under Admiral Vrail, had continued to express their willingness to cooperate. They offered reparations, technology, and even access to their medical advancements in exchange for a lasting peace. For a moment, it looked as though humanity might avoid another war. But beneath the surface, tensions were building, and something felt off. Kale Voss had spent days poring over the data, listening to intercepted alien transmissions, and meeting with human intelligence officers. What he discovered chilled him to the core. Despite Vrail's reassurances, there were signs that not all factions within the alien empire were on the same page. Hidden military communications pointed to a possible resurgence of war-hungry generals, eager to exploit the peace talks as a cover to regroup and rebuild their forces. The aliens' offer of peace might have been a facade, a ploy to buy time and deceive humanity into lowering their guard. Voss struggled to reconcile this information with Vrail's apparent sincerity, and the weight of his dilemma grew heavier with each passing hour. At the same time, on the human side, a different danger was emerging. While some factions, led by Mara Quinn, insisted on holding the alien invaders accountable, others were starting to consider more drastic measures. A faction within the human military-industrial complex, many of whom had fought in the war, believed that no peace with the aliens should be made. They were already preparing for a preemptive strike, planning to destroy what remained of the alien empire and ensure that no such threat could ever rise again. The military, it seemed, had a short memory, and their desire for vengeance threatened to undo the fragile progress made so far. Voss's position had become more precarious. As a diplomat, his job was to find common ground, to build bridges. But now, it seemed like both sides were preparing for war, despite their public displays of diplomacy. Trust had all but disappeared. Quinn's rhetoric grew more fiery, demanding retribution, while alien factions on the other side plotted their next move. The peace talks were on the verge of collapse. Humanity was on the brink of losing everything they had fought for. Voss felt like a pawn in a game he no longer controlled, one where the stakes were too high for even the slightest misstep. During a private meeting with Admiral Vrail, Voss pressed him about the intercepted transmissions. Vrail was surprisingly open about the internal divisions in his empire, admitting that not all of his people had accepted the idea of peace. He acknowledged that some factions within the alien ranks were secretly rebuilding their military forces, hoping to renew the war once Earth let its guard down. Vrail explained that he, too, was fighting a battle against the old regime within his empire, but his position was precarious, and his allies were few. He was trying to negotiate peace, but the threat of civil war within his own ranks loomed large. Voss had heard the alien leader's words, but doubts remained. Was Vrail truly committed to peace, or was he simply buying time? Could he be trusted? Voss had always been a firm believer in the potential for diplomacy, but the cracks in the facade were becoming harder to ignore. The risks of peace were real, and the path forward was not as clear as it had seemed. Meanwhile, Quinn and her faction were making their own moves. The military leaders who supported her position had begun to organize, readying their forces for what they considered an inevitable conflict. They were already planning a surprise attack on the alien colonies, determined to eradicate any remaining threat. Quinn's heart had hardened with the memories of the war. Her losses were too great to forgive, too great to simply let go. To her, the aliens could not be trusted. They had shown their true nature when they invaded, and no amount of words or promises could erase the bloodshed. The human military was not united in their approach, however. Some generals, who had been more focused on strategic planning than vengeance, urged for caution. They knew that any military action now could destroy the already delicate peace talks, plunging humanity back into the same kind of violence they had just fought so hard to escape. But their voices were being drowned out by those who were desperate for revenge. The calls for action were growing louder, and a new war seemed inevitable. As the tension reached its peak, Voss made one last-ditch effort to salvage the peace talks. He arranged a secret meeting with Vrail, hoping to find a solution that could avert the impending conflict. Voss laid out everything he knew: the intercepted transmissions, the growing distrust among the humans, and the military preparations on both sides. Vrail listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When Voss finished, the alien leader took a long breath before speaking. "Your people will never forgive us, Voss," Vrail said softly. "I know that. But I have not come here to lie to you. The Empire is divided, yes. There are those who still want war, and they are preparing for it as we speak. But there are others, myself included, who want peace. We are fighting the same battle. If you don't trust me, then at least trust this: if humanity strikes, if this war continues, it will consume us all. The price will be too high." Voss stared at him, weighing the sincerity in Vrail's voice. The alien leader was not hiding behind rhetoric. He was exposing the painful truth of the alien empire's fractured state. But even as Vrail spoke, Voss knew that nothing was certain. Even if peace was still possible, the forces of vengeance and distrust were powerful, and they were not easily defeated. Voss returned to the peace talks with this new knowledge, but the damage had already been done. His attempts to sway Quinn and her faction were met with harsh resistance. Quinn, who had long advocated for punishment, refused to back down. She was convinced that any peace deal would ultimately lead to humanity's downfall. To her, the only way forward was through strength and retribution, not compromise. And yet, despite the growing divisions, Voss pressed on. He proposed a new framework for the peace talks, one that would include greater oversight, more accountability, and stricter enforcement of any agreements made. The aliens would be monitored closely, and if they made even the slightest move toward renewed aggression, humanity would retaliate. It was a hard compromise, but it was the only one that had a chance of holding. Vrail, ever the diplomat, agreed to the terms, though he knew the risks. The alien empire was far from united, and there would be those who would see the deal as a betrayal. But if there was any hope for peace, it lay in this fragile, difficult agreement. As the final negotiations were drawn up, Voss couldn't shake the feeling that the peace they had just crafted was a thin veneer, held together by fragile trust. The road ahead would be long, and every step would be a test. There were still those who would fight for vengeance, and those who would betray the deal for their own gain. But Voss held on to one hope: that this fragile peace, built on the hard truths of war, might one day give rise to a new understanding between humans and aliens. In the end, the question remained: could they truly build a lasting peace, or would the scars of the past tear them apart once again? The answer, Voss realized, would not come from any treaty or agreement. It would come from the choices made in the days, months, and years that followed. Peace was never guaranteed. It was something that had to be fought for every day. The peace agreement was signed, but its future remained uncertain. On the surface, it was a victory for diplomacy. Humanity had agreed to a ceasefire, and the alien empire, led by Admiral Vrail, had committed to reparations and the dismantling of their military presence. Yet, behind closed doors, the real work had just begun. The trust that had been built over the course of the talks was fragile at best, and both sides were already questioning whether they had made a mistake. Captain Mara Quinn, despite her reluctance, had accepted the ceasefire. But the bitter taste of the war still lingered in her mouth. She could not, would not, forget the lives lost, the friends and soldiers she had watched fall in battle. The scars were too deep, the memories too vivid. For her, the aliens could never be trusted, not fully. The peace treaty might hold, But for how long? Every part of her screamed that humanity needed to remain vigilant, that the threat wasn't over. She knew that even now, alien factions might be plotting something. The signs were too obvious. Quinn wasn't alone in her doubts. Many military leaders shared her suspicions. While some had been eager for peace, seeing it as the only way to avoid further devastation, others were unconvinced. The scars of the war were too fresh, the betrayal too recent. Humanity had just come through an invasion that almost wiped them out. Could they really let their guard down? Would the alien empire keep its word, or would they seize the opportunity to strike when Earth was at its weakest? Voss, who had worked tirelessly for peace, found himself torn. The agreement had been a hard-won victory, but it came with its own set of complications. He had trusted Admiral Vrale, but even as Vrale signed the treaty, doubts crept in. The alien empire was broken, no doubt, but there were factions within it, military leaders, hardliners, and warlords, who still held power, who still believed in conquest. These were the ones who didn't want peace. They wanted to rebuild their strength, ready themselves for another war. Voss couldn't ignore the growing fear within his own ranks. The whispers were becoming louder. What if Vrale was just a figurehead? What if the true power in the alien empire still lay with those who had been the architects of the invasion? Even among the diplomats, the idea of complete trust was elusive. The treaty might be signed, but that didn't mean either side would keep their promises. Each side was still calculating their next move. The alien representatives, while seeming sincere, were not universally trusted either. Vrale himself had been a reluctant participant in the war, and his internal position was shaky. He was trying to lead his people toward peace, but how long would he last if the military factions decided he was a traitor? Vrale had fought against the war, but even he knew that peace would only be possible if both sides were willing to pay the price for it. He had offered everything he could: reparations, demilitarization, and technology. But was it enough? The peace treaty itself had been carefully crafted, but it was full of contingencies. Human oversight would be required on alien territory, and strict monitoring systems were put in place to ensure the aliens didn't break their promises. The treaty also stipulated that both sides would share intelligence on potential threats, but even with these safeguards, no one was convinced it would last. The memory of the war was too fresh. Old fears ran deep. As Voss reviewed the agreement one last time, he was struck by one undeniable fact: peace was a process, not an end. The treaty might hold for a time, but what happened next was out of his hands. There were still military factions on both sides itching for a fight. Both sides had been pushed to the brink of annihilation, and now they were expected to trust each other, to move forward, to build something new. The price of peace, Voss realized, was more than just the treaty. It was the willingness of both sides to let go of their hatred and their desire for revenge. And yet, even as he acknowledged the complexity of the situation, Voss couldn't help but feel the weight of his own role in all of it. He had worked so hard to make peace a reality, but now he understood the true difficulty of what he had done. He had tried to build a bridge between two sides, but the bridge was fragile, and there were many who would try to tear it down. Would humanity be able to hold its ground? Could they prevent the violence from starting again? The path forward seemed unclear. Meanwhile, Quinn had begun to question whether diplomacy could truly heal the wounds of war. She had seen the alien threat firsthand, how they had invaded, how they had destroyed, how they had taken everything. The scars were not just physical, they were emotional, psychological. Trust, once broken, was hard to repair, especially when the enemy had once been so ruthless. The concept of peace seemed naive, idealistic. She had fought for survival, not for reconciliation, and it was hard for her to accept that some of the very people who had been responsible for the war might now be part of the solution. Quinn wasn't the only one grappling with this. Within the human military, factions were already beginning to splinter. Some were content with the peace treaty, understanding that the only way forward was through diplomacy. But others, like Quinn, believed that humanity was simply setting itself up for failure. If the alien factions were as divided as they seemed, then there was no guarantee that the peace treaty would hold. Every soldier, every leader, every civilian who had been affected by the war had their own perspective on what came next. Some longed for peace, some wanted justice, and some were simply tired of fighting. As the days passed, Voss began to realize that the peace talks weren't the end. They were just the beginning. Humanity had a long road ahead of it, and the challenges would be far from over. Vrail had promised his people would comply, but there were no guarantees. The aliens had their own issues, their own power struggles, and humanity had their own demons to fight. The human side, too, had its fractures, and the treaty, no matter how well-intentioned, would only hold as long as both sides were committed to it. The tension was building again. A single mistake, a single betrayal, could undo everything. The sense of dread that had once consumed Earth now loomed over the peace talks. Despite all of this, there was still hope. If the treaty held, even for a short time, it could pave the way for something greater. Peace would take time, trust would need to be earned, and both sides would have to make sacrifices. But if humanity was to have a future, if Earth was to avoid descending into another bloody war, then peace was their only chance. Voss had done everything he could to ensure peace. But peace wasn't something that could be negotiated on paper. It had to be lived, day by day, by both sides. Each move, each word, each action would determine whether humanity could rebuild or if they would fall back into the same cycle of violence that had nearly destroyed them. As Voss stood at the crossroads, he knew that this moment was only the beginning of a much larger struggle. Peace, it seemed, was something that had to be fought for every single day. The question was, would humanity be able to keep fighting for it, or would they give in to the rage and distrust that still simmered beneath the surface? The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the hardest battles were still ahead.